Like, I think it's a very powerful thing to place Indigenous people in the future. You know, first off, as you say, within the genre, we've never really existed there, but
Mhm.
also we were never supposed to have a future. You know, it's like Canada was founded on an attempted genocide of Indigenous people. And so when you look at that, you know, like it's actually a very powerful act just to say that we as Indigenous people have futures and we will exist in the future. Like that is a political thing. It's an activist thing. And when we see like how much, you know, communities are still struggling and youth are struggling to know that they have value, like even the idea of hope and the idea of a future existing can be a powerful idea. You know, our youth deserve to have a future and we deserve to be seen and heard now, but also in the future. And we have already survived the apocalypse. So, yes, we will be there in the future and we'll probably have all the badass skills to help you out when you have no clean water or, like, you know, need to hunt an animal to survive.
Look, you do an incredible job with this movie. You're basically it's a dystopian tale about a mom and her daughter in the future trying to avoid the state that is taking kids away from their parents. And you know what immediately struck me here is like, this is beyond this is not just an allegory of residential schools. You're basically retelling the story, the trauma, all the nuances of what it meant to be of what the residential school system meant. But you know, 40 or so years in the future, like you're just basically transporting it. Like, do you feel it was more beyond allegory in that way? Like, is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the near future environment was just a way to talk about something that's already happened. And so for me, I just wanted to bring, um, you know, the emotional experience of what that's like between a mother and her child. But, you know, the near future thing is just, you know, a container for that, you know, and to talk about other colonial policies that have been inflicted on Indigenous people throughout history. But yeah, no, that was very much the core for sure.
What's interesting is, I mean, we can go back to your short film, Awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in that film, what was the creature's name?
Wisagichak and Wheatigo, the cannibalistic monster, that's the Wheatigo.
Yeah, and this comes from your oral traditions, oral histories
Mm-hmm.
from your
Yep.
community, and I'm guessing you did the same thing here. So talk to me about, so like, like, I mean, I don't, like there's yeah, like there's some there's some narratives about big mosquitoes and such in Night Raiders. Can you tell me, is there some background to that? Is there a history behind some
Yeah,
of
no, the sort of, you know, the story in Night Raiders is constructed, it's made up, but I was basing it very much on the types of stories that sometimes exist in our communities. So whereas Awakening was based very much on the two classic Cree characters that you hear the most about in Cree storytelling, which is Wisagichak, which is a trickster character, and then Wheatigo, which is a cannibalistic being. Night Raiders was kind of going into this idea of taking some of those stories as an idea, but then making up its own mythology in a way. And one of the really inspiring touch points for me was actually when I had a chance to go visit Standing Rock, which of course was like this massive activist movement to block a pipeline in North Dakota. I traveled there, and North Dakota is right below my home province of Saskatchewan. So it's like the land and everything about resistance on the plains like really resonated with me. But when I went to Standing Rock, there was like, you know, when you go into Standing Rock, there's these amazing flags that line like of 200 nations that are all in solidarity together, standing up against this thing. But everywhere you went, there was like this amazing activist art that talked about the black snake. And there was a prophecy within the Lakota people that talked about a black snake that would cross the land, and that many of the folks had interpreted that story to mean that that snake was the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And the imagery of the black snake was just everywhere, and it was so evocative and it was so beautiful that I wanted to bring something similar into Night Raiders. But sometimes it's also easier when you fictionalize things, because there's always a weight to putting something real on screen. Mm-hmm. And even with Wisagi and Wheat-to-Go, Wheat-to-Go is not necessarily described in the old story, so there could be a lot of debate about how that creature would appear. And in my mind, in my imagining, I put it in an old deer body that I imagined that it had possessed. But people can take issue with it, and as they should, but fiction sometimes allows you to embellish things in a way where you have a lot of freedom.
Yeah. Just thinking about, like, you were talking about a Standing Rock, like, and all the different flags together, these United Nations. I mean, we've talked about the fact that this is your movie right now is an alliance between Canada and New Zealand, the two, and specifically, again, you have both of these cultures, like the Maori culture, represented in this film as well, along with the Cree Nation. And of course, one of the big talking points here is, like, you have Taika Waititi as the executive producer on this film. And what was the background there? You met him at Sundance, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think it was 2004 when we both had shorts at the festival. And then we, the global Indigenous film community is uber tight knit, and we meet up at, the festivals like everybody else. But, so I've known Taika since way back then. And then he also came to Toronto to participate in this short film commission initiative that I did for Imaginative when I used to run the festival. And I think that might have been for the festival's 10th anniversary. Mm-hmm. So he came up and collaborated with a bunch of folks up here. And so I've just worked and known Taika as a friend for a really long time. But I think that those global connections lend themselves really well to co-production. And I think a lot of people had been dreaming about that happening for a long time. And we were so thrilled to be the first international Indigenous co-production between Canada and New Zealand. And, when I first started writing the story, I was like, does it make sense that this Maori character would be, like, situated with these Cree folks? And so I took it to a screenwriter that I know from down in New Zealand, Briar Grace Smith, who's actually about to release her own movie down there. And she was just so wonderful and supportive. And she read an early draft of the script and said that she felt it made sense. And then going many years later to Standing Rock, there was a moment of celebration in Standing Rock when the pipeline was temporarily blocked. And the first people that got thanked on the live feed when everyone was celebrating was the Maori delegation who came up and were there in solidarity. And, like, I remember seeing Indigenous folks from, like, South America, and just, like, it was so incredible to feel the energy of when all of those people come together. And I just felt it would be so beautiful to express that in the movie, like those connections that are obviously, we're so different as people, and yet we're so interconnected. And then, like Almaya herself, her dad is Sami from the Indigenous people of Northern Europe. And so we're just so interconnected. And I wanted the film to express that in some way.
Yeah. Well, going back to the Taika connection, because what's interesting to me also is, I don't know if you were involved in the Imaginative report that talked about, like, look at in the, like, so you and Taika meet at a Sundance Film Festival, 16, 17 years ago, right? And
yeah.
Then New Zealand, there was an Imaginative report that talked about how New Zealand, look at what they did with their film industry, specifically nurturing Indigenous film, putting Indigenous film forward. So in the years since that Sundance meeting, New Zealand developed their Indigenous film community and talent. Meanwhile, you over here in Canada had to instead fight for Canada to develop their talent on the forefront at Imaginative, authoring, what was the on-screen protocols?
So I wasn't involved directly in the pathways and protocols, but there have been many reports written by many people, I would like to say, but I did co-author one of them with Carrie Swanson, who's now at the Indigenous Screen Office. And we talked about the lack of Indigenous feature film production at the time. And we did look to countries like New Zealand. And don't get me wrong, it's a fight everywhere. There, here. We also looked at Australia, who had had an Indigenous screen office since the 90s. And we were like so jealous. We're like, oh my God, we need to have that. How can we get that? And also we just felt like we needed the funders to come in and signal that they wanted to be our partners, that they would open doors. And I think for years, people just felt very much outside of these institutions, all of these colonial cultural institutions in Canada. And so, there's been decades of advocacy that has led up to this point, up to the creation of the ISO. And also, Telefilm, to their credit, really started to open their doors. And when we went to them shortly after that report and said, we need to see more money for Indigenous feature film, they targeted funds and made a 5-year commitment, and then started working in consult with our community. And then it led to the hiring of Adam Garnett-Jones, who's there now as an Indigenous person within Telefilm. But I really hope it just continues to grow. Like, to me, that was just the beginning, and that we really want to see many, many more of these projects made. And, when Jeff Barnaby made Blood Quantum, he made the largest budget Indigenous feature. And when I say Indigenous feature, I mean, like with an Indigenous person at the helm of it. Mm-hmm. He made the largest budget one ever made in Canada when he made Blood Quantum. And then just the year after, when I made Night Raiders, then my film became the largest budget. And it's just like, now I want to see someone else get like the big one next year, so that we keep going, because our stories are so important and they're so beautiful and complex, and they have so much to offer, not just ourselves as Indigenous people. Like, of course we care about representation and undoing all of the misrepresentation that we've been seeing throughout film since film's very beginning, since the inception of it all. We've been seeing like horrible representations of ourselves. Of course we're passionate to change that, but we also have so much to offer, like when we talk about the stories of this land, like they have the potential to resonate in ways that I think are massive. Like my dad talks about an oral story that references the glacier, which is like over 10,000 years ago. Like our history, when you look at it contained in museums, it's like, it goes back 150 years, and then maybe there's like a few artifacts and then like some pre-contact things. But like our ideas of the land that we all inhabit together can be so much greater than that. And it's like, that is what we, like Indigenous storytellers can offer. And I think, like what we've been able to do with the establishment of the Indigenous Screen Office, I'm so heartened to see the way it's begun to open the doors for a larger reckoning, with all of the establishment of, different BIPOC initiatives and a Black Screen Office. Like, that's amazing. I think it's so exciting, and I really just want to see all this continue.
The day when you were auditioning for this movie, your star, Elmaya Tailfeathers, she flew in from Queens the day before. She flew in from Queens and directly met with us, with me and Kathleen at a cafe, because we were putting her on the in our Rising Stars issue, and that was but she flew into town to audition for you, and she was saying like, look, I've known Danis for how many years? It's ridiculous, but it's like, but now I'm in awe of having to audition for her. Like, so it's like, can you talk about that audition? What happened the morning after, or that day after, then when she flew in?
Oh my God, that day was like so amazing. Obviously, I've known Elmaya for years and mostly respected her as a filmmaker. I know that she had, I don't think I immediately thought of her as an actor. And then we got sent some material on her. And then, of course, I had the chance to see The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open. It was such a stunning film. And it was actually also through that film that we brought Violet Nelson into our film as well, because she's just so radiant. But Elmaya came in, and her audition just totally blew me away. It's like that thing that you hope for when someone embodies, like we gave her a really crazy intense scene and she just brought it, like I was crying in the audition room and she was just so powerful. Like I was so floored by her vulnerability and her like mix of like toughness, but also like softness. It's like very rare to find that in one person. And she just like cracked open in this beautiful way. And, you know, I think with Indigenous actors, when they're telling Indigenous stories, they're very often tapping into very visceral things from their own lived experience. And I think, you know, as a director, it's like, it goes beyond just some idea of an actor-director relationship. Like there's something very deep, and I almost want to say sacred, in the kind of environment that you need to create in order to hold and honor what people are bringing as actors, because it's so beautiful and it's so brave and it's so incredible. And I'm just so proud of the way she carried this movie. It's so great, and I can't wait for people to see her and the other wonderful cast as well that also did amazing work.
Yeah. Well, and then so she also talked about like how, you know, like you were talking about how, you know, like the future, how the Indigenous people are there in the future. And speaking of the future, I understand your kids would be on set, and I understand they would direct a little bit.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's so funny. My daughter is fierce. She's actually 11 and she's in art school. So she's just an artist and she's super opinionated. She critiques my things, and she'll like look at my movie poster and she'll be like, no, not that. You got to tell the guy to change that. And my son is in grade 9. And so I'm a huge proponent of kids on set. And I think kids actually in any work environment. And I think there's one actually positive thing to the pandemic, because I feel like it's broken down that kind of like really intense separation of like, it's shameful to bring kids into workspaces, you know, where they're like walking in their pajamas in the background. And I kind of love that. Like, who doesn't want to have their day brightened by the presence of kids? And I think in Indigenous spaces, like children are a part of every Indigenous space. You know, you go to an art gallery opening that's for Indigenous artists and there's kids like all over the place. And that presence is really important. And yet in so many workplaces, it's still like kind of like shunned as this thing. And so it wasn't just about bringing my kids onto set so they could experience it. It's also like bringing them in to be a part of something and being proud of them being there and sharing that space with them. And my daughter and son both got to call action, and they were calling it in like a super, like one of the biggest scenes that we were shooting, and it was so intense. Like, I don't even know how I got through those shoot days. And that was the day my kids came to visit, just to like throw everything out there. So we're in this super intense emotional scene, and Almaya has to like totally bring it. And there's like an 11-year-old going like, action, you know? But I really hope that it, you know, was something that was just like embraced as a part of the way, you know, embraced with love, you know, because that's why we bring our families into the process, and then extend that out to the people that we're working with.